WRJ Boogie in full effect mode. Bun down is the sound. You know how we do. This is, of course, The Lounge Presents, and we are streaming on Twitch right now live. And as always, we'll be posting this to Spotify in 2 days or Monday. This will be up Monday morning. And today, in the lounge space, for the very first time, we have someone who I wanted to get on. We wanted to get on some time back because I actually took a course that she was facilitating, and at the time I was like, it'd be great to get them on the pod because the topic is so dope and very timely. And so I mentioned it to her via DMs. I kind of wanted to get you on. We still do it. I'm like, let's do it then. Okay. So without any further ado, let's give it up one time for Francesca D'AMICO-CUTHBERT, Ph.D.
Thank you.
I made a note of stressing, underlining, bolding, and italicizing the PhD because my mark ass forgot to put the PhD in the marketing that was on social media. And so my apologies again to you, Francesca.
It's all good.
That was an incredible gaffe. Charge it to my head, not my heart, please.
It's all good. It's all love. Thank you.
I was telling her, she put in the work to earn the PhD. The least I could do is put the PhD behind her name. But we got it right here on the banner, so people know. How you doing?
Don't. Good. How are you?
I'm good. How's everything over there? Are you guys getting the heat like we are?
Yes, though I have to say, I'm between my teaching of hip hop and all the different hats I wear. I don't get to go outside much, which is it's a crime in the summer. I need to get outdoors. But yes, it is warm here, and to be perfectly honest, I'm not a summer or a heat person, so I'm liking being inside.
I hear you. I love summer, but when you start getting heat warnings, you know what I'm saying? That's just a little much. And it honestly, it makes me think of anyone who's unhoused. Can you imagine what it's like being this?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Nothing makes me check my privilege like that thought right there.
Yeah, whether it's the extreme heat, extreme cold, absolutely. I hear you on that. Yeah.
For real. So Francesca, we always start off by asking everyone how they were introduced to hip hop culture.
Okay, I will say my earliest memory of hip hop, probably maybe around 9 years old.
Okay.
Television. Big shout outs to Rap City, Much Music.
Yes.
And the first artist I saw on television was Maestro Fresh West. So, but did I know that that's what it was? It was hip hop. I can't say that I do entirely, but that's my first recollection of kind of putting the pieces together. A lot of my memories in terms of music and how my taste, the trajectory of my taste, I'd say 1989 was a big year for me. The biggest record that I think has shaped my life and that led me to love a particular line of hip hop culture, I would say, was actually not hip hop. It was Janet Jackson, Rhythm Nation. That whole album was really it really shaped my consciousness. And I learned later on, that she was deeply inspired by the tone of hip hop culture. She was seeing what was happening. Obviously, Public Enemy is the group that most comes to mind, but obviously KRS-One, Rakim, like there was a huge dynamic shift in the culture. And so I learned later in kind of researching that album that she was intimately shaped by not just the politics of the culture at the time, but obviously what was happening in the larger scheme of things. And so I'd say in terms of that was the most powerful record for me as a person. And in terms of, where my consciousness has gone, but also the kinds of hip hop I love. And then obviously, I'd say the album that really shaped me and led to me actually doing a PhD is Fear of a Black Planet. So for me, Public Enemy is huge. They're a huge group in just why I love the hip hop that I love and my politics and also what kind of leanings I have by way of the culture. So I'd say that those were kind of the pieces that shaped yeah, my love for hip hop and my most earliest memories. And so, like I say, 1989 was just it was everything for me.
Yo, Fear of a Black Planet was a serious record.
Absolutely. On every level, on
Woo!
every level. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Sonically, I feel like the Bomb Squad got even denser with their sound.
hmm
You know what I mean? It was like,
Yep.
whoa, like the 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 Bomb Squad is easily hip hop's wall of sound. You know,
Absolutely.
man, what they did on that record though, oh my god,
And at the time, we couldn't even foresee what was about to happen, right? By way of the changing of laws and how they, affected production, right? Question of intellectual property and how that shaped what people put into records, how they sampled, how much they sampled. I mean, obviously, Bomb Squad and Public Enemy, more broadly prior to really 1991, when we start to see those legal changes, they were known for having records that were just stacked with sounds, right? From all kinds of things.
yeah,
So yeah, I didn't really understand at the time as a child, like how much it would shape me, right? Because also, yes, I live and breathe hip hop every day, right? As an academic, as a researcher, as community organizer, as an instructor. But my tastes are very eclectic. I started as a musician. Actually, I started as a dancer. My backstory, but as a musician, one of the things that I think we don't talk enough about in hip hop is that so many people in the culture have such wide, vast, eclectic tastes, and that and the wider someone's palette is, the richer the productions that they create, right? And so I didn't quite. I see it now as an adult, but I didn't understand at the time that some of my appreciation for groups like Public Enemy was because of how vast the palette was, right? That they were exhibiting through the productions that they were creating.
I hear that. I hear that. What were you listening to when you were growing up? What was being played around the home when you were growing up?
So I would say, my background is Italian Canadian. Um, as a child, both of one of my parents, for the longest time, was learning how to speak English during the course of my childhood. So I had both languages in my home. So I was fairly, I wouldn't say fluent, but I had to speak both languages, and I had a lot of cultural music in my home,
Okay.
and so that I think shaped my like deep love for music that is not necessarily English, English language speaking music as well. Um, but I would say that much of what I got at home was culturally specific. My access to what was mainstream came via school to a great extent, but also I was put in dance very early. And so interestingly enough, my dance teachers were the ones that actually expanded my music tastes, right? It was my dance teacher that introduced me to Janet Jackson. So I would say that being put in the arts as a child, I started in dance. I eventually moved into the dramatic arts. And then at some point in time, a teacher identified that I could sing. And I ended up becoming, by and large, a musician. I say most of my energy was put into being a musician. So yeah, I would say that a lot of it came from just being immersed in the arts. And as well as a lot of children do. I mean, I'm a product of the 80s. And so I had a deep fascination with radio and radio programmers and hosts. And so I'd love listening to like the top 40 on Saturday mornings and emulating radio DJs and hosts, making my own little mixtapes. I didn't know they were mixtapes at the time. I just
Yeah.
liked recording off of the radio and then doing little interludes in between. So I was fascinated by that kind of stuff. But again, I didn't necessarily as a child have a consciousness that that's exactly what I was doing, right? It was just something that I loved. So I'd say that, again, my love for music, especially as I ended up going to an arts high school. And so there, my taste expanded even further because we did a lot of, historical understandings of music. So stretching all the way back to, obviously things like classical music, but from a vocal music standpoint, which I'm trained as a vocalist, we were doing everything from blues and jazz and soul. And so I was open to all kinds of music, right? Just by virtue of being immersed in the arts.
Okay. Okay. Let me rewind a bit to dance. Was it hip hop dance?
So, as is typically the case, from in terms of when you're a young girl, For some reason, it's always, put the young girls put the young girl in ballet class. So that's where it started, which again, I think my history in dance reflects just my own personal evolution. So I started off, with ballet classes. I moved on to jazz classes. When I went into high school, I was in a program. I was at a performing arts high school, and there, our dance program, we were introduced to all kinds of genres. So, musical theater, obviously jazz, tap, ballet, but also more contemporary styles of music and dance. And so when we started to get into the age bracket where we had a little bit more liberty to shape our own interests and tastes, that's when I started veering towards hip hop dance, right? Because that just reflected also what I was listening to, what I was interested in. Um, and so one of the things that, I'm not sure if we'll get here, but one of the things that I discovered at that young age was the way that the schooling system really does not create space for hip hop. There's a perception of hip hop culture, right? If you take it to academia, there's this perception that hip hop is anti-intellectual, which couldn't be far from the truth, right? But also from a performing arts sector, what I was discovering as a young person, and this is why I was always pushing my teachers to put this in the canon, was that people who are in the arena of whether it be breaking or hip hop dance, right? The dance vocabulary, the way that breakers and hip hop dancers introduce just incredibly innovative and novel ways of moving the body, right? And creating storytelling through dance, it deserves to be part of the dance canon, right? So if you're going to teach students dance in performing arts school, there needs to be place for hip hop. And so I was pushing at a young age for that. I wasn't successful because of what I was coming up against, but I think that was one of the first moments that I had as a student where I really started to think about the kinds of things that we're allowed to learn in schools. And it really, I would say, activated me around pushing our teachers to create curriculum that speaks to us as students, right? That was, I think, the beginning for me when I really developed a consciousness around that. And it's a consciousness that, followed through well into becoming a graduate student. And then I use it now to shape the kinds of curriculum that I'm developing as an instructor, right? It's very much dialogic, because as teachers, we're not always going to be on the mark, right? Yes, the culture is 50 years long, but actually we're in year 51, but we're not always tapped in, right? In the way that young people are tapped in. So again, it's conversational, and that's how you build curriculum. And so I figured that out very early, and it became something that I became very passionate about.
It's interesting that you bring up hip hop dance and curriculum, especially with dance studios, because there was a time when there were dance studios, that had no knowledge of hip hop at all, and
Mm-hmm.
they were offering hip hop dance classes with no history about hip hop at all. Like literally just like come here and dance like music videos type shit, you know?
Right.
You
Right.
remember that, okay?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm so glad now that you walk into a dance school, and if it's a serious dance school, and if they're offering hip hop, you were getting the full deal. You were
Mm-hmm.
getting the full history of hip hop, where it came from, what influenced the dance, the whole nine, because it just wasn't the case, what, 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah, even more, even more. Like I remember in my school, there was a specific hallway in our school where all the breakers would go. And you'd pass the hallway at lunch and you're like, what are they doing? Right. And you'd be wondering, like, why are they doing this in the hallways, but not this in the classrooms? Right. So there was a huge gap in terms of what students, was driving their interest. And then even when, over time, you could start to see that programming coming into the classroom. But even at that, to your point, was very diluted. It was very removed from the attributes of, for example, in the case of dance, breaking or hip hop dance, but also
Oh
the
yeah.
context, right? That's something that really, I'll say, I'm passionate about, rooting hip hop and the elements always in their context, because you cannot understand hip hop and engage with it in an ethical way unless you know its context. The two
Agreed.
have to be paired, right? And so this is
Agreed.
why people in the education space are always saying you can't just sub in anybody to teach hip hop. They
Nope.
have to do the knowledge, right?
Yeah.
They have to be representative of that act of doing the knowledge. And so, Again, I think those things always have to be paired because that's what's going to give us the most well-rounded understanding of what we're engaging with when we think about the culture.
I hear that. I hear that. Let me ask you this: when you were coming up, slowly discovering more and more about the culture, were the folks around you similarly also diving into the culture along with you, or were you like an odd person out?
I will say it was it was a mix of the two, right? Because much of my education was in the 90s, and like I say, that was, I was moving between elementary to high school and then uh roughly into university. And so I spent a lot of the night I spent yeah, about more than half of the 90s in high school. And as much as I love the experience of being at a performing arts high school, one of the things I learned was uh, what I would eventually come to teach about, which is the way that pop culture and culture broadly tends to be uh, parsed out, right, based on audience, right? So this old school conception of lowbrow culture versus highbrow culture, and the way that that shapes canon and how that's taught to people who are forming their artistic practice. And so a lot of what was happening in my high school was, okay, this is canon, this is good art, right? And the list is long. And this is art that's, it's of the people, but it's not high end art. So there are a lot of stereotypes shaping what was coming in the doors of that school and what people were learning, right? And so there were elements of that schooling experience where, we'd be in the cafeteria and we're doing different things at lunchtime, right? Like maybe we're dancing in the corner, we're sitting at our lunch table talking about certain music formats. But that stuff was not in our curriculum. It wasn't in the classroom, and we had to really fight to to have that the things that we love be recognized. So a lot of what a lot of what was happening for me was there was recognition in some of my peer group. And again, because it was a performing arts school, people were coming from all across like southwestern Ontario. So you got a very eclectic group in terms of taste, but also experiences, right? So, you know, um, a lot of the young people that I went to school with, they're like from the Lakeshore, for example, that area of Etobicoke, and maybe they're mixing up with different neighborhoods in Toronto. And so we're representing the places that we're from and the musics that we identify with. But then there's people from other places coming from Hamilton, and they're also coming from different musical worlds. Some people are really about musical theater or classical. And so that you're having all of this stuff kind of rub up against one another, right? In this really interesting environment. So I'd say there was a mix of both, but it always felt like the things that we loved, there wasn't really place for it in the curriculum, right? So a lot of what was shaping my own personal taste wasn't happening in the classroom or on class time. It was happening during lunch, before school, after school, and in any of the things that I was involved in from an artistic standpoint.
So you knew early on, it appears that you wanted to have a hand in being able to shape how people learn about hip hop. Is
Hmm.
that safe to say?
Yep, that's absolutely safe to say.
And your resume obviously points to the fact that you followed through on that. Now, coming from an Italian household, can you recall what the family said to you when they told you what direction your vocation was going into?
In terms of hip hop, or you mean in terms of grad
No,
school?
in terms of hip hop.
It was all support. It was always
Nice,
support.
nice.
And part of the reason is, for those who are familiar with my work, a lot of my work is angled on the way that hip hop pushes back on different levels of oppression. It speaks back to state power, uh, and so that was always a concept or set of concepts that I grew up in. I grew up in a very political household. We were always engaged in politics as a family, and my father in particular, right? His political engagement and activism stretched back to his youth, before he even moved to Canada. And so it was the support wasn't just because I was a musician and I was really into hip hop and I was taking it all the way to grad school. but it was also because my engagement with hip hop and the work that I was creating was through a political lens, right? And it was always looking at how hip hop has both shaped the world and in a lot of ways spoken up and against the powers that be. And so I'd say that it was, yeah, it was always support, and it was on that level because of the way that I was engaging hip hop.
That's dope. And I can see why the support was there based on what you just said. But that's awesome. I asked that question because more time. Trust me, more time.
I hear
The
that. I hear
answer is
that.
very.
I hear that. And I think
Yeah.
too, for me, the other level was, I was jumping into academia is not, I'm the first person in my family to go all the way. I had cousins before me who, maybe they went to undergrad, they finished, but I was the first person to do undergrad, master's, PhD. This was entirely new territory. And so I think in a lot of ways, there's an incoming, I'm first generation Canadian. There's a pride in that, but there's also, a little bit of caution. Like, what's this journey going to look like, right? What's going to be on the other side of that? And so, similar to people who are, venturing off into the arts, I think the hesitation for parents is always, is this going to turn into, a job, employment, income, right? And so because it's like you're engaging in something that is a first, right, for you and for by extension your family, the some of the insecurity can come from that. But in terms of the content, there was never there was never any resistance, which I'm grateful for because I know that's not the case for all people.
No, seriously, that type of support is golden. Just golden.
Absolutely.
And I'm glad that you had that support system around you because it obviously helped to fuel what you were doing. Even though I'm sure regardless you would have done it anyway.
Oh yes. That's my personality. That's my personality, right? Like just forge forward because also I genuinely believe, right, if this is a calling on your heart, it's like you're supposed to do this work.
Yeah.
You may not know why entirely, you may not have the vision forward crystallized, but it's something that you're being called to do. And the reason for that calling unfolds over time.
I hear that all the way. Now, earlier this year, I enrolled in a course called "It's Bigger Than Hip Hop 2: Celebrating 50 Years of Women and Gender Expression in Hip Hop." And I'm going to be full disclosure with you on this. I wanted to enroll in this course to find out what exactly you were going to say
Hmm.
because, as you know, when it comes to OGs, and when it comes to OGs in this culture, we're very protective of
Mm-hmm.
this culture,
Mm-hmm.
hugely protective of this culture. So when there's a platform where people are going to speak on the culture, sometimes there's a fear that it's not going to be as informative or as educational as it should be. Not saying that I went in with that mindset with you,
Sure.
but I think because of that innate just feeling to protect the culture,
Mm-hmm.
the curiosity, of okay, what's going on? What's going to say? All right, hold up. So naturally, we're going to look up who the person is that's instructing the course. Oh, okay, okay. So this should be interesting. It should be very interesting. And then after taking it, I can honestly say I'm glad I took it because not to say that I didn't already know everything that was introduced in the curriculum, but I was very familiar with everything that was talked about.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the part that really got to me was all the discourse that came out of it. There's some very interesting perspectives that were presented from other people that took the course, and that to me was what really kept me there in
Hmm.
the continued discourse because first of all, big up your curriculum, okay?
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm not gonna say I was gonna like pick through to see if you knew what you were doing, but salute.
I passed the test. I passed the
Oh,
test.
for real, salute. That was a very, very well hit on all the points. And I think more importantly, the fact that it was celebrating 50 years of women and gender expression in hip hop
Hmm.
was the catch. So when you decided to put this course together,
Hmm.
why did you want to do it?
For a couple of reasons. First and foremost, I was asked to do this course.
Okay.
You know, Partly, I'll say it was because it's the reason it's called is bigger than hip hop too is because there was a part one, right?
Right.
And the part one was by and large about the origin story of hip hop and the elements, and just a kind of ground floor looking at hip hop culture. And so when the discussion was had about, okay, what's the part two going to look like, we had some conversations, and one of the things that I really thought long and hard about was, what did hip hop 50 look like? And if you kind of you draw back and you look at hip hop 50, it was very rap centric. And I have considerable critiques about that. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Because there are 9 elements in hip hop after all, right? And, four of which are the primary ones, and then people start debating about the other ones, but 4 plus knowledge of self, and then a couple others. So I was quite critical of the rap centricness of hip hop 50, but also the male centricness of hip hop 50, right? And where women did appear, I mean, they were, and respect to the women that did appear, but they were the usual suspects, right? The Queen Latifahs, the MC Lights, and some others. But I was really concerned because women have been in the culture, of the culture, since the beginning.
From time.
And a lot of times they are narrated out. So one of the things, in terms of my training, my background, I'm a historian. And historians, yes, are very preoccupied with facts, but we're also very preoccupied with story. How do stories about the past get told? And one of the things that most of us will argue is that stories are political. They're constructed in a particular way to get across a particular point, and that can change at any given moment, but stories are not immune from bias, right? They're not immune from having a political end to telling the story in a particular kind of way. And so I wanted to shape a class that profiled women in the culture, profiled them as being there from the beginning, but profiled the names that we know, the names that we don't know, but also thinking critically about why we know some names and why we don't know others. But also, to your point, about loving the culture and wanting to protect the culture, and and the people who are the OGs. When we look at the stories of women in hip hop, what that translates to a lot of the times is that we don't always have very sobering, honest, and transparent conversations about what happens in hip hop, right? And so there are figures in the history of hip hop culture who, yes, are towering. They have done tremendous things. They have made incredible contributions to the culture, but they're also deeply problematic, right? And so if we look at the history of hip hop through the lens of gender, what story emerges and what kind of honest dialogue can we start to have? This doesn't mean that it has to be prescriptive, that, what I say or any other person says is the be all end all of that narrative, but
Right.
we need to have honest conversations about hip hop, because we're at year 51 and there are some things happening in this culture that need to be addressed, and addressed in a real way, right? Because it's a culture that involves, at this stage, the globe, right? And not just it doesn't just platform certain people. So I think that was really what shaped the desire for the course. And for clarity, the course was offered through Hart House at the University of Toronto. So it's also part of my desire to see hip hop in the university, right? That was another part. And as you know, the course wasn't just open to university students, right? It was a course that was open. It was open to anyone who was interested in enrolling. And so, as you well know, we had people logging on. It was remote. We had people logging on from other parts of the world, right, other than where we were located. So it was really great to see the level of interest also,
Yeah.
right? Because a lot of the times when we program hip hop learning opportunities, the assumption is, who's going to want to spend 5 weeks or 6 weeks or 12 weeks learning about gender and hip hop? And is there enough content? That's another thing that people always, they always assume. And that could be further from the truth, right? And so that's part of the reason also that when the course was crafted, it was women and gender expression, because that allows us then to have very important, critically important conversations about how masculinity presents itself in hip hop. Because after all, masculinity shapes the tone and the textures of hip hop in very interesting ways that have led to positives, but also have led to other more problematic, right, encounters and outcomes. So that was really how that course kind of came into being.
Will this course be offered again?
Not in the immediate future, but there's some programming coming out at Hart House at the University of Toronto that's extending the look at gender, women in the culture. So there's other kind of attributes that are still looking at the same subject matter, but not necessarily in that course format.
Okay. I mean, you've done some great work with Hart House.
I try, one of the things which is wonderful, I commend them for, they're in year 5 of their hip hop education program. And they are a co-curricular unit at the university. So they're not, it's not an academic unit. However, they do a lot of important work that centers, skills building opportunities for people around hip hop. They're doing work, bringing in people from the hip hop community to engage with students. And I think that's the way to go, right? If we're going to think about the place of hip hop in the university, it absolutely has to be with the culture. I don't see it going any other way, right? They have to be partners, because that is, after all, what hip hop is, right? It is a cultural movement, and it doesn't happen without the people and the politics of the people. So I think a lot of what's happening there at Hart House is deeply commendable. And they're at the top of it, because hip hop studies is not it's not fully evolved in the same way that it is in the US, right? I mean, in the US, you can go to virtually almost any school, and they have something on hip hop going on, whether that's a hip hop certificate, a minor, there's programming. Here, in typical Canadian fashion, we are well behind the curve. So we have some catching up to do, but I have no doubt that it will happen.
I think you're helping pave that way for real.
Thank you. That's my hope. That is my hope.
Yeah, no, for real. One thing with Hart House that I know is Flex has been running breaking sessions there.
Mm-hmm.
Salute Flex and BTX all day.
Indeed.
He's been running sessions there for, man, I don't even know how long now, like Sundays,
Mm-hmm.
I believe. So obviously Hart House is serious, because they have folks like you, Flex. Is there anyone else doing
Breaking Canada? At any given time, we're introducing, we're bringing in people. So, there's some programming coming up in year 6 where we're really going to engage a lot of the architects. And that's another thing. My PhD work was on the US, right? So I am by training a historian of the United States in terms of my PhD. But when I went on to do my postdoctoral studies, it happened, I would say, not because I didn't have an interest, but I had given a presentation on the history of Canadian hip hop, and the paper was so well liked that somebody approached me and said, "You need to publish that." And so I published it, and I ended up being the first historian to ever publish on the history of Canadian hip hop, and I won an award for that. And thank you. I didn't say that for the class, but to say that that's what got my wheels turning, like, for not the award piece, but the why am I the first?
Yes.
Why aren't there people before me that have been published in the realm of historians, right? There were people, people like Ronaldo Walcott, Mark Campbell, Remy Warner. There are a lot of people who had written about Canadian hip hop history, but from other, I will say, disciplines, right? But I was the first person that had been published in a Canadian history journal. And so that led me to want to write more, research more, and more importantly, platform. I'm from Toronto, born and raised, and to platform my city. One of the things that I really am troubled by is that we're 51 years deep into hip hop history. And unfortunately, but this is also, there's a hopeful tone to this, right? Unfortunately, there isn't any one place that we can go to and say, where is the deep and rich and long history of Toronto hip hop that I can just tap into if I want to learn? Is there a book that I could read that gives me all of that from point A to point Z, right? So there's an opportunity here for us as people who are interested in Canadian hip hop. And so, and for me, more particularly Toronto hip hop, I feel, I mean, that's really where my interests lie now, um, in terms of profiling, platforming, and just having conversations about the history of Toronto hip hop, and especially in light of recent phenomena, I will say, which I'm sure you know what I'm referring to. There is a real illiteracy around Toronto hip hop history, right? That we need to correct. We need to step in, intervene, interject, and correct. And part of how that gets done is it is not because Toronto hip hop architects don't want to tell their story. That couldn't be further from the truth. They do want to. And when they're tapped, they do tell their stories. So we need to just do the work to pull that all together. And there are a lot of good folks doing that work all around, right? So I'm excited about where we'll be in the next 5 to 10 years. Because I think, yes, the hill is high, right, in terms of the goal and the objective.
Oh, yeah.
But I think that if the intention is to do that work to preserve, which we do need to do, right, in similar ways to many scenes in the U.S., I think what will come out of that will be evidence that Toronto has been there since virtually the beginning of hip hop, right? There are many people on record who have said, I remember hip hop expressions in Toronto, in the mid to late 1970s. That doesn't put us far off from the origin story of hip hop, south of the border. So, and I have heard folks from the Bronx literally say to me, hip hop went north before it ever went west, right? That's the story that needs to get out. So when people say, Toronto ain't the culture, they couldn't have been far. They're so far off the mark, right? And it's part of our job as folks who are interested in Canadian hip hop, Toronto hip hop, to make sure that that story gets out, and that the story comes from the community, right? Because so much dynamic stuff happened in the city of Toronto, and it's just people need to learn about it.
Yes. And that narrative that is front and center all over the place that you're alluding to, there's a lot of crazy shit being said, man.
You said what I wanted to say. I was trying to be diplomatic. There is a lot of crazy stuff being said, and it needs to be curbed and corrected, right? Because some of this stuff being said about Toronto doesn't have a sound. What? Yeah, and just also to the names of people who laid the groundwork for what this scene would be. Rumble, for example, that name needs to ring out. Plenty other names need to ring out, right? But that's the one that comes top of mind if we're talking about Toronto sound, right? And so these are some of the things that I think correcting the narrative, right? Correcting the narrative that seems to have led to an illiteracy about the role and place of Toronto in hip hop culture.
I love how you put it, the illiteracy of it.
It's an absolute illiteracy, right? And I mean, I could go on for days, and trust me, it's literally been weeks since this phenomena, I will call it, happened, right? But it's the way that Toronto has been framed in this conversation that's very troubling to me, right? But it's also, and again, I think, as someone who's outside of the US context, right, we're putting a different lens on it. So for me, what I see going on there is not just an illiteracy about our scene, but also a desire to write us out as though we're not part of the culture, right? And so I think, adding to filling out the story of what is Toronto and its place in the culture will help to correct that.
That's a good way of putting it, filling out the story. And I think because of the fact that historically Canadians always know more America than Americans know about Canada, right? So that's just, come on.
And there seems to be an expectation of that, right? So one of the interesting things that has emerged, especially as people have been critiquing this video as of late, I read the comments because they're, as a historian, it's like they're the details that we piece together, right?
Yeah.
I read the audience comments and people will say, oh, Canadians don't know anything about LA. Well, the same could be said about the way that Toronto is being read in this particular phenomena,
Yeah.
and that the reading of that is indicative of again, a lack of awareness, a lack of doing the knowledge and the history of Toronto hip hop. And so from that emerges like really problematic statements, right? So yeah, I think there's an air of that. There's an air, and I think what you're speaking to is an American exceptionalism, right?
Yeah.
That rings out in this particular context that seems to suggest that and it is true, Americans created the culture. They are the center and at the origin of that story. However,
always acknowledge that.
and everyone has acknowledged that, right? But it's global, and in its global iterations, it looks different depending on where it is,
Yeah.
right? And so every place where hip hop touches down has given their unique contribution to hip hop culture, right? And so they're echoing back their version, let us say. And so I think what troubles me is this American exceptionalism narrative that is a bit confusing to me, right? Because if the culture is being projected out across and outside of your borders, why then is this response coming through in the beef, right? Because it's an outcome of translating your culture outside of U.S. borders. That you're going to get expressions of the culture that don't quite look exactly as its origin point, but has its spin based on the local expressions and taking up of hip hop. So there's a lot of complex things that I think emerged out of this recent beef that I think point even more so to why we have to invest in preserving our stories in Canada and telling them as loudly as possible.
Yeah.
Because there seems to be a misunderstanding, like we ain't been here for some time.
Do you think that is more generational, or do you think it's across the board when it comes to like our American homies? Do you think it's generational? Because if you look at Gen Xers, Millennials, Zers, and I mean Alpha and on, do you think that each generation looks at it in the same way, or do you think that the later generations have a bit more of the viewpoint that's been popping off?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a mixed bag of things, right? Because even if I teach a course on hip hop history at York University, and so what I find, generally as speaking, I've been teaching that for almost 10 years, is that generationally, I think hip hop culture suffers from like gaps in between generations, and so the translation of the knowledge across generations, is difficult. So you might get somebody who's most familiar with the 2010s who really doesn't know anything about the 70s or the 80s and marginally the 90s, right?
Yeah.
So that's just a product of the way that I think hip hop knowledge seems to operate across the generations, that I don't think is unique to the US or Canada or what have you. But I think the other part of that is that when you couple that with the way that the US and its history seems to take up a lot of space in the hip hop room, for lack of a better term, right?
Yeah.
What's happening here is that people don't, and Toronto also suffers from the post Drake world and the pre Drake world, and so the presumption is, and this is both locally and we can obviously point to the States and see this happening as well, that there's this presumption that there was, I don't know, nothing or hardly anything before Drake, right? Which again, when you do the knowledge, you know that that's not the case. And so, but what I will say to the credit of many people is there are a lot of people that know that Toronto has a history, right? In the US in particular. I've had innumerable encounters, because some of my work that I also do is I'm the lead researcher at the Hip Hop Education Center, which is based in New York City. And so to their credit, and the credit of many people that I engage with all the time, lots of people know the names that ring out from places like Toronto, right? But what I will say is they're the people who have a deep, deep knowledge of hip hop. So, and that sets them apart from folks who might just engage with it marginally, right? Or their knowledge is really based in the local or what have you. So again, I think it's a mixed bag of things, but definitely one of the things that I think hip hop needs to work on is the generational connect, right? Because if we look at a genre like rock, right, you could be 23 years old, but you know who the Rolling Stones are, you know who Aerosmith is, you know the Beatles. So again, what's happening there, that it's kind of, you know, an investigative thing that we need to engage in. What's happening over there in that genre that maybe we need to think about and you know, find our own unique approach to in hip hop, so that we can ensure that young people, because also the perception of hip hop is that it's a young person's game, right? And so I don't know if it's like a throwaway thing that whatever is old, you know, ain't new, and we don't want to engage with that. Again, it's a mixed bag of things, but I think we could take notes from what's happening in other genres, right? In terms of translating the knowledge across generations.
Very well put. Very well put. You'll have someone like Chuck D, who has acknowledged Mishimi
Hmm.
enough times, right?
Yep.
But then would someone like YG acknowledge Infinite,
Right.
right?
Yep.
It's just not going to happen.
Yep. And it could be, you know, to your point, because Chuck is a great example. Big Daddy Kane recently did that with Mishi, right? Is it because they've had engagements with them, right? Like they've been shoulder to shoulder on stages with them, right? So maybe that's why they're generationally of the same generation.
Yeah.
So it can be that. It can be you know, interpersonal relations. It can be the fact that I'm of your cohort in hip hop, and so I know of my peers,
Yeah.
right? So I think there's a lot of moving parts. But I think part of, you know, doing the knowledge is an element, and so we do that, and I think we'll close the gap as best we can. You know, and there's also mechanisms that we already have in hip hop where, you know, things like crate digging,
Yeah.
right? Where we're already interested in history. It's part of the culture
Oh yeah.
that we're
Oh,
looking
yeah.
back always, right? To look, to create and look forward. So I think even with that, we already have mechanisms built in that we just kind of have to strengthen and translate. And I think they will do the work of bridging the generations and closing up that gap of knowledge that we oftentimes do see.
Exactly. Exactly. God damn. This is what I was looking forward to this. I knew that we were going to have a good episode because after having taken the course, I knew who I was dealing with. I knew, you know, how you were presenting yourself, and I knew you came with facts. Yo.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I appreciate
Really,
that. I really do. Thank you.
for real. It was crazy because I actually knew someone else that took the course. We hit each other on the side like, yo, you taking it too? Yo, word up. It was dope, actually. It was pretty sick.
I love that.
What have you? I mean, you were already in the midst of your work. What have you got coming up in the near future
That I can disclose?
that
You
you
know,
might be
there,
able to hint at? Trust me.
yeah, sure.
I'm all for, you know, keeping cards close until you're ready.
Yeah, of
But
course.
anything you can hint at?
Yeah, of course. So like I said, I kind of wear multiple hats. I'm engaged in a lot of work. So with the Hip Hop Education Center, south of the border. So I'm based in Toronto, just for context. We're currently working on the timeline of women in hip hop history. And so this will be, you know, if you want the place to go to get that info dating all the way back and finding the names, you know, the Lady Pinks of the world versus, you know, the Charmin 65. People know Lady Pink, but do they know Charmin 65? That's where you're going to get that information in the timeline, right?
Nice.
So there's that going on. I also work with an organization called Roots Rhymes Collective.
Right.
Our focus is pretty well exclusively on archiving and preserving the history of Toronto hip hop. Last year, I should say, sorry, we did a big hip hop 50, let us say, series.
Yes, you did.
Yeah, where we brought
Salute for that.
together. Thank you. I
Salute for
appreciate
that.
that. You know, that started because I kind of looked around and thought, where's the programming in Toronto saluting our city,
Mhm.
right? So I was addressing what I thought was a gap,
Yeah.
and I got into conversation with some people, educators, but also people straight from the culture, because it's also my practice that I'm a builder, right? I want to work in community and collaboration, and I want to work with the people in the culture. So, you know, some of the members of the group include Michelle Geister, Some of you might know as the producer and the creator of Rap City through Much Music. Spade from Citizen Kane started as a b-boy, went on and was simultaneously working as a graph artist, and eventually went on to be an MC. And so we did a series of events, everything from doing a listening circle with K-Cup from Main Source to a 30+ person conference on the history of Toronto hip hop with people from every angle of the culture. Obviously, the four elements, but also people who were in production and in the music business, and people who were in television and radio. Extensive. So there's that. We have some programming coming up in collaboration with the Hart House, which will platform musicians, Canadian hip hop musicians, in a live entertainment setting. That's what I can say at this stage. We have, hopefully, fingers crossed, a symposium on the way as well, celebrating a really important anniversary of one of the, let us say, most important platforms in Canadian hip hop history. Again, I know I'm speaking abstractly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll just get you back on to talk about it.
Dope. I would love that. I would love that.
Yeah.
I would love that. And then in terms of my work with Hart House, we're doing some programming as well. We're doing some masterclass sessions with architects from the Toronto scene. We are doing we're doing skills building stuff. So if you're a producer, if you're a lyricist and you want to learn more about the craft, you want to learn everything from, how to create your artist profile to how to get funding, to how to, produce and engineer something. We have a program called Producer Circle Lyricist Lounge, and people can come out. It's a weekly program. There's one currently happening this summer. We'll have sessions in the fall and winter of the academic year, so starting back in September. So if that's of interest to you, look up Hart House and their programming around hip hop education. We have a series of other things in the mix that will engage people across Toronto hip hop generations. So that's another thing for me is I want to spend a lot of time giving flowers, right, to the people that started this, and connecting them to the subsequent generations, right? And so, yeah, my politics, I move my politics in my work, right? It's very important to me that, again, I'm an academic, right? That's my day job. I'm a programmer of hip hop content as well in the academic space. And I see my role there as facilitating space so that people in hip hop can tell their stories and share their crafts. They're the real ones to salute. I'm only, this is the calling on my heart, and I'm just following it through. So, and then outside of that, I spend a lot of time doing research. So doing oral histories, a lot of what I've been doing since the pandemic has been doing oral histories on the history of the rap music business in Canada and the ways in which Canada lacks a hip hop infrastructure. So I think that's the other part of it, right? When we ask why, for example, did this beef look the way that it did, and there was a seeming illiteracy around Canadian hip hop, I think the fact of the lack of an infrastructure has a lot to do with it. What would happen, and this is a question, what would happen if we had an infrastructure akin to the US market? Would Toronto have a different profile? Would there be a different understanding of what this city, this scene has been about, right? Maybe not. We don't know that. It's we're working off of a probability. But I think the fact of a lack of a hip hop infrastructure matters. And most of my research now is focused on why that is. Why do we have a lack of a hip hop infrastructure? And hopefully some of my work in the future will be to address that gap in real material ways so that
important work.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm doing, more so of like trying to understand, trying to get an understanding of why this has happened historically. There are a lot of people on the ground doing work to address that gap and to find solutions moving forward. Because, as we who love hip hop know, it's one of the most important, rap music, we should say, is one of the most important global genres in the world. And so to not back our artists in the way that we should is strange. I'll say that diplomatically is strange. But most of us know what's really up. We know why this, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And so I think part of my role in the work that I do is to call out why that's happening. One of the prime reasons is anti-blackness, and stereotypes of hip hop,
Yep.
which run the gamut from, it's misogynist, it's violent, it's criminal, right? All of these very problematic tropes. They have seeped into the music business, clouded the judgment of people who really should be putting backing, financial backing and visibility, right, in terms of marketing and communications behind these artists, because Canada does not suffer from a lack of talent. It's the
No.
opposite. It is the opposite,
Hell no.
right? I could think of innumerable MCs. Top of my list is Mathematic, right? I mean, what
Look
an
at you. Hell yeah.
incredible lyricist, right? Why are we not giving Mathematic the visibility that he deserves? I mean, those of us who love him and have loved him for a long time, we know what's up.
Yeah.
But why isn't he profiled in the way that a Black Thought is, a Mos Def, a Common, right? The list is long. For me, if somebody asks me who's in my top five, Mathematic is in my top five, and he's alongside some of what we would call the US grades. He makes it to that list for me. So my hope is that my work will kind of give some context to why these kinds of things happen, being that I'm a historian. Um, and that, and I salute the people on the ground who are doing what I think is a real work to transform the landscape of the hip hop music business. And we've only talked about rap music, but the same is
Yeah.
true of graffiti. The same is true of breaking. The same is true of DJing, right? There
Yep.
doesn't seem to be the kind of support and visibility, that we see in the US market,
Yep.
right? I mean, people hail up all types of breakers in the US. They create platforms for them.
Yep.
Is the same happening here? I mean, we can go to many of our greats, and I'm sure that they will tell us a story that looks a lot like what's been happening to MCs in Canada.
Yep.
And so this is something we need to address and be honest about, because everything is about, we can't transform something if we don't address it head on.
Exactly. Well, Francesca, I'm glad that we have you in our culture, helping preserve our culture, helping share our culture, and helping educate people about our culture, because your role in the culture is so important, and I'm glad that you're there doing it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I really do. And thank you for having this platform. I'm so grateful that we connected. I can honestly say, right, like as a teacher, as an educator, it's like, yes, of course, the expectation is the teacher's going to bring the content, but real talk, like in those classroom sessions, it's like I learned just as much from all of y'all. The conversation is just as enriching. And I know that there were many points in the conversation that you added, right, to the knowledge in the room. And I'm so grateful for you and for the work that you're doing, because again, this is, when we talk about the culture, this is all the moving parts of the culture,
Yeah.
right? And we need it all to strengthen the work that we're all doing in our own lanes. So thank you for having me. I was very excited to be
So glad
in
we
this
could connect.
conversation. So
No,
gratitude
yes.
to you always.
And it's not going to be the last. You've already hinted at some future ting. Okay.
Yes.
So you know you're
Yes.
coming back, right?
Yes. I'm down. I'm down. And
Okay.
I'll bring people with me if that's,
Oh
I'll
yeah.
bring the team with me to discuss. Because the other thing too, and this is a bit of a call out, hip hop is about community. So there's a lot of heavy lifting that needs to be done to preserve the history of Toronto hip hop. And I'm gonna botch the saying, so I'm not gonna say it exactly. But in essence, we go faster when we go together.
Yes.
So this is my genuine call out to people. Um, if that's something that you're interested in doing, reach out, because I would love to work with anybody whose heart is with preserving. For me, it's Toronto hip hop right now, and it will be for a very long time. That's the work that I'm on. So if that's something that's of interest to you, please do reach out to me. I'm always interested in collaborating with people, if that's where their heart lies.
Excellent. There you go. Well, we know we're going to have you back in Lounge Space again, Francesca. So we're not even going to say goodbye. We're just going
Okay.
to say, you're going to be back again. But I really, again, want to thank you
Thank
for
you.
spending time with us in Lounge Space. The work you're doing is so important. I love the fact that I was able to use the word pedagogy in referring to an episode because we just don't have enough of that here in
Hmm.
Canada. You brought it up earlier. Excellent point. Yes, in universities across the US, there is definite hip hop studies, but here in Canada, it's just there's this huge dearth. But
Hmm.
you are at the forefront right now, and we salute you all day, Francesca.
Thank you. Thank you. I salute you as well. Much love always.
Oh yeah, definitely. Till we get you back in here to talk about the next thing. All right.
Indeed. Indeed. I got you.
All right. Salute, Francesca. Peace.
Peace. How'd that go? What'd you think?
That was good.
Yeah?